All right. Go.
Welcome. I'm Kate Johnson, Sustainability and Environment Manager for Proseco in Lawrence, Kansas. And I'll be the facilitator for this webinar. And our webinar is What's in Your Building? Material Transparency Tools and Strategies. I'd like to thank Nancy Larson and the K-State Pollution Prevention Institute for co-sponsoring our webinar today. Now, briefly about my education and background, I've got a Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry from Southwestern Oklahoma State and Master's of Environmental Studies from Friends University in Wichita, Kansas. And my 30-year career includes working in both the public and private sectors in the state of Kansas. I'm going to make a few introductory remarks about our topic today that includes indoor air quality, but I'm also going to tell you, first of all, who the other speakers are. Following me will be Jeremy Knoll, Project Manager and Architect at BNIM in Kansas City, Missouri, and he'll explain material transparency and how important it is to know what furnishings and building materials are made of and how to protect occupancy health. Our next speaker will be Jasmine Moore, Sustainability Director for the City of Lawrence and Douglas County, and she will be speaking about why employers should care about what's in their buildings and what they are made of, and provide some tools that the City of Lawrence uses to protect community health and the environment in their buildings. Finally, Nancy Larson, Director of the K-State Pollution Institute, will talk about her organization, including the internship program that can help companies work on pollution prevention and air quality. So let's get started with our webinar. Next slide, please. So Americans spend approximately 90% of their time indoors. And that is why we're very interested in what's in your building, what's in our buildings. And because buildings do impact our health. We breathe the air in the buildings and we're inside most of our waking hours. So health experts estimate that indoor air quality places more than 40% of the US population at risk for serious health impacts. And that can include asthma and respiratory disease, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and may even cause neurodevelopment and reproductive problems. Next, please. So our buildings can have contaminants move inside from outdoor sources and also from building components, the building materials, equipment, and emissions from different types of equipment that are in the building, as well as components and furnishings of the buildings. There are also other indoor air sources depending on the type of activities that go on in the building. Synthetic chemicals make up the primary components of our construction materials, furnishings, and consumer products. So it's estimated that less than 5% of these industrial chemicals have ever been evaluated for toxicity and bioaccumulation. And in many situations, there's insufficient health data to understand their effects on human health before they're even used. So studies indicate that some chemicals may be harmful to humans at doses that were once considered negligible. Indoor air makeup can be a complex mixture of hundreds of chemicals, and chemical-laden dust particles can also be of a concern in what is in our buildings. Also, controlling the use of pollutants at their source is really the best way to do this. You really can't make sure that all of the indoor pollutants are eliminated, except that you can take a look at what's being used for materials, furnishings, and finishes when you start to put your equipment and materials in a building, in a new building or even existing buildings. So to fully understand the material transparency, you really need to understand a little bit of context as to where we've been with the laws and regulations in the United States. Also, individual states have some of their own and voluntary initiatives are important. Why don't you switch the slide next, please? So we all remember some of the regulatory situations that happened in the 70s and through up until the 2015 years. We had asbestos identified as causing problems for people. Lead in paint, indoors and outdoors, were identified. And also mold has been found to be impactful for people's health. The asbestos rules, many of those rules came about by controlling the different types of uses for asbestos. While it wasn't banned, the uses have been controlled. There's also lead paint requirements for homes and buildings, particularly anything prior to the 1960s. And then also, there's not really very many regulations regarding mold. But what really came about is in the next more recent years, and a lot of this was because of some devastating hurricanes that happened. We had to have significant construction in the Southeast with Hurricane Katrina and other hurricanes that devastated those communities. And because of so much construction going on, we had to bring in trailers to house to provide extra housing for people in those communities. And we also had to have a lot of drywall to bring in for construction. Well, formaldehyde was found in the Katrina FEMA trailers, and it really did impact people's health as far as headaches and allergies and all sorts of respiratory problems. And it was also found that there was Chinese drywall that had been brought in because so many of the, it was really put a huge stress on the drywall industry in the United States. So we imported a lot of drywall, and hydrogen sulfide was found in that, and it also caused a lot of respiratory issues. So it became much more clear that the indoor air was impacting people's health. Next, please. So in the more recent laws regarding indoor air quality and what's in your building, the Federal Trade Commission updated the Green Guides in 2012. And with that, they required manufacturers to no longer say that there is zero volatile organic compounds in materials. They had to be fair and be able to have some proof into what sort of claims manufacturers were making with their materials. The Toxic Substance Control Act was reauthorized in 2016. In California and New York and others passed new laws and regulations that had to do with toxic chemicals and transparency, wanting for people to be aware of what was in the product as far as labeling, and this included cleaning products. And so in 2018 and 2019, California has the new cleaning transparency law, and California and New York are important because they have there are large populations that command that manufacturers do this all over the United States, because so many of the products and materials go into California and New York. So that's why it's important for Kansas and other states that may not have rules and regulations. California has a big impact on manufacturers all over the United States and outside of the country. There's also voluntary toxic ingredient removal increasing. So many manufacturers realize that it's time to remove some of these toxic ingredients. So these are starting to happen. And also voluntary transparency labeling is increasing so that you can see on product labels. So would you switch the slide, please? Also, another trend is non-governmental organizations, NGOs, are placing pressure and campaigns on manufacturers and companies that sell consumer products that may have harmful or toxic materials in them. Clean Production Action, and you can see the website here, safechemicals.org, has produced a report card called Mind the Store, and it lists retailers' report cards. That's important to note that they're making this public so that the different companies are called out when they're less than transparent with the materials and products that they sell. Also, the Center for Environmental Health are looking at what's in products, and they have done a lot of testing on toys and jewelry for children to see what kind of toxic materials in those. And that has to do with a lot of also is what's going into buildings. But that's providing a pressure and campaign to manufacturers and retailers. So the retailers' response has been that they want to have consumer product transparency. So Walmart, Target, Walgreens, Amazon, they've all come up with their own, recently in the last year or two, come up with their own mission statements on how they're going to be more transparent with the products that they sell and try to remove the toxic materials from that they sell. And so it's important that everyone start looking at the labels, because now there's more and more information available. So that provides a little bit of the information about the trends. And now I'm going to introduce Jeremy Knoll and tell you a little bit about Jeremy's background. He is, like I said, the project manager at BNIM, and that is in Kansas City. And he's got a deep passion for green building and social equity, and he's worked over 14 years on a variety of projects as an architect, including high-rise hotels, a zoo's master development plan, a LEED Platinum Crime Lab, the Space Shuttle Museum at the Kennedy Space Center, and has been a sustainability leader in over 50 LEED certified projects. Jeremy is the chair of the Central Plains chapter of the U.S. Green Building Council. He has a BS degree in architecture from Washington University in St. Louis and a master's of science degree in architecture from K-State. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Kay. You can't manage what you don't measure. That's a phrase that I think rings pretty true for this presentation. Starting in the mid-2000s, the architecture industry became very aware that buildings use over half of the electricity and a third of water in America, and are responsible for nearly a half of the carbon emissions as well. And so coming out of that knowledge and the beginnings of really the sustainability and design movement with the advent of LEED and other methods, we began to look at an increasingly connected and complex system of measurement for our buildings to understand how they were using energy, developing smarter controls and measurements. And we've gotten to a point next where we are looking at a whole wide variety, really an ecosystem of third-party labels and certifications to help make sense of the complexity and to develop a common language around everything from sustainability to transparency to how a building sits on its site. To call a few of these out, Architecture 2030 Challenge is about using less and less energy over time with a goal of using net zero energy by the year 2030. The LEED certification and the U.S. Green Building Council label is all about holistic measurement of sustainability. I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. Park Smart is actually about measuring parking lots and parking garages. Well is about the health and well-being of the occupants of a building. And for the building and design and construction, there's a whole other tier of labels to track and be aware of. These here on the right, which include everything from Energy Star to cradle-to-cradle certified products, which has to deal with where a product is extracted from the earth or the recycling system, how it's manufactured, and then once it's done with its useful life as a building product, what happens to it then? Can it be reused or incorporated as a new building material into a new process? Water sense is about products that use water using less water, and a whole host of others that we have to keep track of. Next. So just to break it down and simplify it a little bit, I have two kids, one 8 and one 4 going on 14, and their nutrition is very important to me. I make their lunches, and most of the time I make dinner. And so when I'm at the grocery store, I tend to look really carefully at these handy nutrition labels that are all over any of the store-bought products that I'm buying, which include information on sugars and fats and vitamins, things that help me understand what choices I'm making on what I'm bringing into my home. So with that same thoughtfulness in mind, shouldn't we be thinking of that same through that same thought process for the daycare where my daughter goes to school, or the school that my son goes to? Shouldn't I be as concerned about the products and materials that they're exposed to every day as I am with the food that's going into their bodies? Next. So to pull one of the certification systems out that I talked about on my first slide, LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. This is a product of the U.S. Green Building Council, which was founded in 1993 and then created this certification system in 2001. It's consensus-based, based on a wide variety of industry leaders and manufacturers. It provides a holistic measurement of everything from controlling utility costs to analyzing and helping to maximize user comfort, to making sure that air quality and site biodiversity are considered, and quite a few other things. But it provides a point-based system to compare what would otherwise be apples to oranges buildings to each other in a way that is fair and equal between them, measuring everything from existing buildings to new buildings to campus certification, and now we're even getting into neighborhood certification and beyond. So it provides a great measuring stick for a lot of different programs, and is compatible with everything from sites to WELL to the Living Building Challenge and ARC. And once you've gone through the certification, you're awarded one of these 4 levels of certification, whether it's certified silver, gold, or platinum. So again, it's a way to measure the performance of a building. Next. So the LEED categories, and you can see this is laid out like a nutrition label, just like we were looking at before. But the LEED categories, just to run through these quickly, the integrative process is about having the sort of the right team involved in the project at the beginning. Location and transportation, about where you're locating and how you get there. Sustainable sites is about biodiversity and stormwater, and what's happening with things like sunlight and the heat island effect on your property. Water efficiency obviously is both about the efficiency of your use of water once it's in the building, but also your efficiency of water for irrigation and effluent coming out of the building as well. Energy and atmosphere, it really deals with the energy systems of the building, so the efficiency of your air conditioning equipment and lighting, the renewables that may be associated with your property, whether your building included commissioning to make sure the building's systems were installed correctly. Then materials and resources is all about both the materials that are coming out of the building during the construction process, the waste materials, and whether those are going to landfill or being recycled or reused, as well as the materials that are going into the building itself. So where did a piece of material come from? Where was it extracted? How far did it have to come overseas, or just a few miles? And then finally is the indoor environmental quality, which is the one that we're really talking about here mostly today, is about the indoor environmental quality of the space. Everything from access to, this one in particular deals with everything from access to daylight and fresh air, to the quality of the materials that are being installed, and whether they are off-gassing various chemicals and compounds that could be polluting the atmosphere. There are a couple other credits here that are shown below. The innovation and regional priority. This just has to do with where your building is positioned and what are the most important credits for that particular building to emphasize. So giving some weight to different credits through the rest of the system, and giving an opportunity to come up with new ideas. Next. So the results of following this system is really here on the right. Just to run through a few of these. There is a cost to register and certify and a cost to document a project, but the savings are pretty enormous. When you start to look at a 30 to 40% average savings on energy and water in a LEED building, when you look at a 2 to 10% increase in employee productivity, and then really the big one to me is absenteeism. This is more than a third reduction in absenteeism in buildings that are LEED certified. The idea being here that if your people are present in your office building or school, then they're being productive. Then the money that you're spending on the people that are in the space is really maximized, and that's where most of the benefit comes from for LEED and green buildings. Next. So starting in the 80s, we started, I guess I should back up and say starting in the 70s when we had an oil crisis, and we started working at the beginning of the EPA and looking at energy efficiency in buildings. Without a lot of thought, we started closing up and being more careful about the weather envelope of our buildings, without understanding that there was a lot of toxins in the materials themselves within those buildings. So we had a wave of what was called sick building syndrome or sick building issue that really became a health issue that was dealt with by LEED and a focus on energy and increasingly on healthier products that go into our buildings. Next. So to break down what we're talking about with the healthy products, there are really three types of what are called volatile organic compounds. So you can think of a VOC as like the new car smell is essentially the chemicals that are off-gassing from glues in the various materials making up the interior of your car, and so those are airborne volatilized compounds that are then inhaled. So that's where you get the smell, right? You can also think of a new building that maybe wasn't LEED certified, where you can smell the carpet as you're walking into that space. Those are typically VOCs that are essentially gaseous and inhaled, and typically are carcinogenic or have other issues associated with them that are very bad for your health in the long run. So LEED really opened our eyes to VOCs as something. And now that we're looking at the material transparency, we're talking about these other two types of VOCs. So they're non-volatile organic compounds, which means that they do not become, they don't become volatilized, they don't become vapor or part of the air, so they remain solid. So asbestos is a really good example where asbestos lining around a duct, for example, really until you start manipulating it or cutting into it or trying to remove it, and the fibers become, they start to break down and absorb into your skin. Really volatilized is when they degrade into dust and are absorbed in that way. Same with lead. And then semi-volatile organic compounds are ones that really can do both. They begin as a solid, but can absorb the dust. They can be inhaled. They can be ingested and just cause all kinds of problems. So the Living Building Challenge is one there that has introduced an idea called the Red List. That begins to capture all three of these in a way that we can start to understand and measure. Next.
Good. And Jeremy, I'll just remind you to speak right into your microphone. We're losing your audio a little bit.
Okay, sorry. So to take a step sideways here, I'm talking a lot about measurement systems that are about what you're designing, but there's also a way to measure the performance of a building. So I just quickly want to talk about the LEED certification system is primarily prescriptive based. It gives ideas for strategies and modeling. It gives operations policies, recommendations, and informs, and ultimately is giving you performance guidelines, and it's a one-time certification. There's a new system out now called ARC that is performance-based, so it's about measuring a building as you go along through a calendar year, where you're measuring the efficiency of your utilities, you're creating operations policies that are measured over time, and you're doing things like air quality tests in an ongoing way so that you can start to see the life and performance of your building and end up getting an ongoing certification. Next. Jumping back to the red list here, this is really the red list that combines a whole host of other primarily government agency reviews of chemicals of concern and consolidates them into a single list of materials that should be avoided in terms of building products and paints and sealants and so forth. And so this is a pretty long list, but I want to point out 4 of these in particular that are the most common offenders and really the most difficult to remove from a building right now. There's not always a great alternative in the building products yet. But these are ones that we find that we just have to really spend a lot more time looking out for and being careful not to include when we can. So chromium-6 is the first one to point out. This is a material that is pretty pervasive in our buildings. It's part of everything from drinking fountain piping to sprinkler piping. It's really the chrome plating that goes into stainless steel and other metal products that is just very hard to, there's not a good alternative for that yet. Next is formaldehyde. Formaldehyde actually is a naturally occurring chemical that is part of wood and wood products, but we tend to use it as an additive to blended wood products as a glue, essentially, or something to help bind materials together. And so we end up using a lot more of it than we should. So beyond just the background level that we find in wood, that becomes extremely toxic, and it's everything. It disrupts all sorts of parts of the human biology. Next is halogenated flame retardants. These are again just in a lot of products as a way to help a product meet a certain smoke or flame rating. These HFRs are added to those products. This is especially pervasive in foam plastics that we use for insulation and some things like carpet backing and so forth that just are in a lot of products. And we're finding as we're pushing on the industry, there are alternatives to this one that are becoming more common as we go along. And then finally, the last one I'll point out here is polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, which is really everywhere. It's in so many products. And I know BNIM, as a rule, works to completely eliminate PVC from our buildings. It's just something that we, understanding what it does, especially once it's volatilized, it's really one of the worst chemicals on the planet Earth. But what it does for a plastic is it makes it flexible, and there are not a lot of alternatives to that yet. There are some that are becoming more common, but this is one that we really have to stay pretty vigilant about. And then here on the right are just a few of the impacts of using these products or of building materials that use these. You wouldn't think that products that can damage the reproductive system, cause diabetes, cause breast cancer, and harm the immune system would be common or allowed, but they are. They're really in most of the building products that we use. And so by pushing on the industry and asking for transparency, we're starting to be able to identify where these chemicals are used and be more careful about what we allow into our buildings in the first place. Next. So this is a handy chart to help identify some common sources of red list products in your home and actions that you can take. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you can see just sort of on the ends, you have a list of what the products are. There's a color, like for example, the phthalates is that light blue color, and then you can look at the house diagram and start to see the color-coded locations of where you might find that kind of chemical in your house. And then looking back at the chart, you can see what the damaging effects of that product are, and then how to avoid them, what ways to either find alternative materials or seek out ways to protect yourself from those chemicals of concern. Next. So we really have two emerging tools or systems now that we're looking to increasingly to help us understand what's in our buildings. First that I'll go through is Declare, and then the second is the health product declaration. So these are really doing very similar things to each other, but in a slightly different way. The Declare label provides really a top to bottom list of what's going into a building product, but it gives some additional information here as well. So starting at the top of the Declare label, this is a voluntary system that material manufacturers can sign up for and provide data for. And then on my side as an architect, I can specify that that our building needs to include either Declare labels or health product declarations for let's say 50% of the products that are going into it. And then I can identify particular target areas like paints and carpets and gypsum board and so forth that I know there are some emerging solutions for. So to just run through the Declare label very quickly here, starting at the top, we've got the name of the product of the company. We know we've got an indication of where the material itself was assembled, how long that material is expected to last. So if it's a 10-year exterior house paint, for example, there'll be some indication of that. Or if it's a chair, let's say it's a 5-year product or a 10-year product. And then the end of life options tell us once that material is done with its use, with its useful life in that building, how much of it can be recycled, how much of it has to go to the landfill. So I've got some indication of what that can become next. Then getting down to material ingredients, this is really the meat of the transparency conversation. This is a color-coded list that if it's in gray, then it is a red list compliant material. If it is in this sort of dark orange, it is a red list chemical that is in the building product. If it's in this light orange, then it is then it's an EPA or REACH chemical that is still included. So it's a little bit outside of the red list, but still something that we need to be aware of and concerned about. And then finally at the bottom there, what we end up with is one of three options here. So a building product will either be red list free, meaning that there are no red list products in it, red list compliant, meaning that it might have a red list chemical in it, but it is one that is essentially grandfathered in until an alternative chemical or process is identified that can allow it to perform the same way without being included. And then declared, which is saying that there is a red list chemical in there that is being that the manufacturer is identifying that could be replaced but has not been yet. So then we move over to the right to the health product declaration, and this is going beyond a typical material MSDS sheet, which is typically a gas chamber measured effect for a building product that looks at down to about 1,000 parts per million, and then the health product declaration goes further down to the chemicals at 100 parts per million. So a much finer look at what's going on inside of a building chemical. And this is actually a Proseco product that is health product that is compliant through this system, but it essentially is disclosing the chemical makeup of a product. in a way that makes it easy for me as an architect to review and understand that it is doing the things that I need it to do before I'll really allow it to come into a building that I'm working on. Next. So I'll end my section talking about certification and really the importance of third-party certification, whether it's in your building products or your building as a whole, because it's about transparency, it's about proof, and it's more, as an architect, it's much easier for me to guarantee or to protect a building from including chemicals that an owner might not want in there, to make a building that will perform that way that an owner wants it to, if we're pursuing a certification that gives us the ability to really measure the results of what we're doing. There are some links at the end of this presentation that'll give some additional resources. And I will now turn it over to Jasmine.
Jasmine, I'm going to first introduce you. So this is Kay again, and Jasmine is going to be our next speaker, and she is the Sustainability Director for the City of Lawrence and Douglas County. Her background includes over a decade of experience in the field of local government, including city and regional planning to community-based coalition building. Jasmine currently serves on the U.S. Green Building Council Central Plains Market Leadership Advisory Board. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Applied Behavioral Science from the Kansas University and a Master of Science degree in Community and Regional Planning from the University of Texas at Austin. So, Jasmine, go ahead.
Great, thank you, Kay. So Jeremy talked a lot about the importance of knowing what's in your building, and he specifically mentioned the sick building syndrome earlier. And if you've ever worked in a place that had a funny smell or you felt like you were getting headaches all the time, then that may have been a sign that you were being exposed to some harmful chemicals. And so employers should care about material transparency, because that exposure can actually lead to increased number of sick days and an overall decrease in the quality of life while at work, which ultimately leads to increased costs to insurance premiums and payouts. So one question would be to ask your HR department if they have noticed that people that work in certain buildings take more sick days than those that work in other buildings. That's some data that may help give an indication to if there's a problem regarding the building itself. Next slide, please. So I've spent the last 10 years working for local government in Kansas, Arkansas, and Texas, and I'm going to talk about the role of local government and material transparency, with the acknowledgement that government and transparency have not always gone together. However, more and more local governments are making a conscious effort to make decisions in a more transparent way, anything from meetings and who's at the meetings to budgeting and purchasing. So there's many ways to leverage public dollars to reduce harmful health and environmental effects, and I'm going to talk through a few of those today. So first, many local governments have a green procurement or a sustainable procurement guideline that applies to anything from office supplies to equipment purchases, landscaping, construction, and even like vehicle purchases. So that is one way that local governments can start to make decisions about how they're using your public dollars. And there's some resources at the end of this presentation to get you started to investigate what that might look like for your business or company. Scaling up a bit, governments make huge capital expenditures each year, like wastewater treatment plants, building new facilities like courthouses, police facilities. They do tons of road construction and spend millions of dollars on these infrastructure pieces. And these are also opportunities to invest in material transparency and public health. And so asking your local governments how they are accounting for health considerations and many of the topics that Jeremy and Kay covered earlier in these multi-million-dollar projects is something that you can do. Most local governments also have economic incentives, whether that be tax abatements or other incentives like that. And so consider how they can add an element into the economic incentive package that addresses material transparency. For example, the City of Lawrence offers a tax abatement for projects that build to LEED silver standards. And so that's one way where they are using the city to leverage that type of development and encouraging material transparency that's associated with the LEED standards in economic development. And lastly, on this slide, most local governments issue public bonds to finance really large projects. And bonds that finance projects with a positive environmental benefit can actually be designated as green bonds, which are becoming more and more popular with investors that are concerned about where they are spending their money and what they're investing in and want to move away from fossil fuels and other things that are contributing to greenhouse gases and climate change and so on. Actually, Lawrence issued the first green bonds in the state of Kansas last year in 2017, and those bonds were used to finance energy efficiency improvements in different city facilities. So with this bond structure, it requires reporting out each year on the performance and being able to quantify what those environmental benefits are. Next slide, please. Local government also has a strong interest in keeping hazardous materials contained in general. Our first responders, like our firefighters, are exposed to many of the products that we talked about earlier and are at a much higher risk of developing lung cancer than the general public, which can be attributed to some of their exposure. And actually, Jeremy does a whole presentation just on this subject. Research has shown that when those toxic chemicals that are in our buildings burn, they become embedded in the personal protective equipment that our firefighters wear. And it doesn't just end there. Even after they take off their suits and put on their regular street clothes, it's been found that those same chemicals are found in their personal vehicles and even in their homes. So even when they take off their uniforms and their personal protective equipment, some of those chemicals are staying with them. So much so that fire departments are changing the way that they clean their personal protective equipment after a fire event. And in Lawrence, we recently invested in making sure that every firefighter has a second set of personal protective equipment so that they are not just putting on that same material and that they will have a chance to thoroughly wash the materials and uniforms in between fire events. Most communities also have a household hazardous waste facility where people can bring their old paint, cleaning products, oils, and things like that, because we have a strong interest in not having those products flushed down the toilet or dumped down the storm drain or put in our landfills. So after this presentation, if you are motivated to go home and look and see what's under your sink and see what cleaning products you're using at your home, there is most likely a household hazardous waste facility in your community where you can take those hazardous materials instead of trying to dispose them in the trash or some other way. Next slide, please. So it's one thing to adopt a policy about material transparency, and it's a whole nother thing to actually implement the policy and monitor its performance and keep the local governments accountable to what they said that their intent was. So one of the ways to help keep local government accountable is to have something like an advisory board. And the City of Lawrence has a sustainability advisory board whose mission is to promote environmental protection, to advocate for policies that support sustainability, and to enhance the quality of life by enhancing the city's efforts in these areas. The Sustainability Advisory Board is made up of 10 members of the community, and they really provide recommendations to the City Commission and staff on sustainability issues. So that is another check and balance in this presentation and thinking about the role of local government in this topic of material transparency and how we can make sure that if the government says that this is a priority for them, that this is something that they're invested in, something like a sustainability advisory board can help make sure that they are held accountable for that. And that's it for me. I'll turn it back over to Nancy or Kay.
Okay, thank you. Nancy Larson is the last speaker, and she is the director of the K-State Pollution Prevention Institute. She also leads the Kansas Small Business Environmental Assistance Program. Nancy graduated from Montana State University with a degree in environmental health and microbiology, and she's been managing the Pollution Prevention Institute's program for 20 years. So Nancy, take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kay and Jasmine and Jeremy. It was really, really interesting to learn about this transparency issue and what's in our building. And so as Kay mentioned in one of her first introductory slides, one of the things that's key is really to identify the source of the problem and to work for source reduction. And at the Kansas State Pollution Prevention Institute, that's exactly what we do. We work with helping industries identify ways that they can change the material, the process, or the technology to reduce emissions at the source, not even generate them in the first place. We've been working with Kansas industries since 1989. We're 100% grant funded right out of the College of Engineering at Kansas State University. We're kind of a mix between environmental health people and engineers. We have two primary programs. Kay mentioned the Small Business Environmental Assistance Program, and that program helps small businesses with compliance, air quality compliance, hazardous waste, and water compliance. But I really want to focus on what we do under our pollution prevention program, which is a grant from EPA. We help businesses identify those ways to reduce emissions at the source. And this year under our grant, one of our national emphasis areas, because we have 3 national emphasis areas at EPA, but one of our national emphasis areas is very much around hazardous materials, specifically Toxic Substance Control Act material reductions, and even drilling further, the 2016 work plan that where TSCA has identified 90 chemicals that they're doing risk assessments for, and then there's a top 25 from there that they're really digging into right now. We're also working a lot with food processors and manufacturers. So if you're listening to this webinar and you're one of these industries and you're interested, we would love to work with you. We have a pollution prevention intern program where we train interns and then we put them with industry for 10 weeks, mentor them, and they have to identify, they work specifically on source reduction projects, and they quantify outcomes related to environmental outcomes, energy, water, chemical reductions, and then they make a business case for it. They calculate the return on investment and what are the dollar savings. And just since the inception of that program in 2006, we've worked with more than 80 companies in Kansas and identified about $14 million in cost savings. And the purpose of this program is really to take our university students, most of them, 95% of them are engineering students at the junior, senior, or this year we had quite a few in the graduate level, but they're engineering or environmental science students. We've got host industries who have dedicated pollution prevention, source reduction projects, bring all that together to ultimately then reduce those costs and those emissions, right, for the state of Kansas and for the industries. And a lot of times that can also equal reduced regulatory burden as well. So if you reduce your VOCs, your hazardous air pollutants, because you've maybe gone from a wet painting process to a powder or a higher solid, you may have also reduced your permit, your air permit level with the state of Kansas. So why interns? they're able to take the time to tackle these projects. They come in, they are fresh eyes. And one of their big things that we train them to do is just simply to ask why. Why is this done this way? Why are we generating this waste? Where did it come from? And a lot of times what we find the answer is from industry is, well, we're not sure, but we've just always done it that way. So they are able to take the time that you aren't able to dig in and trace the process back, put all the elements together, and then do additional research to, like I said, kind of put a case study together for you for, gosh, do we want to change this process? What are the recommended processes? How much is it going to cost, or how much is it going to save? So it gives you a great place to start. Many times they're able to implement some of these recommendations right while they're on site. So these are not students who rewrite manuals. These are students who get in, do measurements. We've got quite a bit of equipment that we loan out to the students that they can use for testing water flow, ultrasonic leak detectors, thermographic cameras, that type of thing. And they're able to pinpoint where leaks are, where the savings can be found. These are the results that you can see from our program: 342 million gallons of water saved, over 80 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, and then, like I said, about $14 million. So our program, I just wanted to give you a taste of that at our website, which you can see there. We've got an intern program page. We've got over 70 case studies, 2-page case summaries and studies posted at that page. Our applications from host companies. So host companies do apply, and we can help you identify what kinds of projects you might have. But our applications are due in December. So please reach out to either myself, Nancy Larson, or our intern coordinator, Linnell Ladd, and we'll be happy to assist you.
Okay, thanks, Nancy. I think that if you'll switch it over, we do have our speaker contact information. Thank you, Nancy, again for having the Institute sponsor this webinar. And thank you to the other speakers, Jasmine and Jeremy. We really appreciate all of this information. Is good information for you and the people that you work with, the building owners, architects, schools, and other local governments. Be sure that they have an opportunity, people that you know that might benefit from this presentation, pass the link along to them as well. You can see that all of our contact information is here. All of us are experienced in this area. Feel free to contact any one of us if you have questions or want further information. Also on the next slide is a lot of embedded links that you will be able to open that Jeremy has worked really hard to provide. A lot of this is very good information, and some of them are also applicable to the various different green building standards that are out there. So we hope that you've enjoyed the webinar, and we'll look forward to hearing from you by email or by phone. Thank you very much, and this will conclude our webinar. Thank you.